Hello, hello.
Hello.
How are y'all tonight? Awesome.
Tired.
Tired, yeah. Yeah. It's the weird in-between season that we have right now. It's kind of like our bodies are anticipating it getting cooler, and then we get like 2 days, right? Those kind of cool, and then back to second summer. Yeah, awesome. Well, I'm gonna let you guys know. So typically I've got kid coverage. We had uh, my mother-in-law was going to watch my kids tonight, or my son, because my daughter has two types of practices tonight for something for choir and for acting. And we didn't know about this until like Saturday, because she tried out on Saturday, and then they were told Saturday that she made the chorus of the play. So um, my son is probably going to be sneaking in here in about 10 minutes or so. And so if I have to pause this every now and then, just letting you know that that's happening. But it's life happens. So we move forward. As I mentioned last time, with the classes moving forward, we'll have these every Monday night, and really the intention of these, really the spirit behind me providing these meetings is to give you some space and to ask questions related to the course material, um, and especially tonight, if nobody ends up having any questions, I've got a few things I do want to talk about, but other than that, we will typically wrap up whenever y'all don't have any more questions. But um, I will be posting uh, a few mini like lessons, like I told you last time. I just had a big presentation at Northeast Texas Counseling Association on Friday. I'm going to be posting some of those resources as well for the how to assess ADHD and what that is, and yeah, and some different tools for that. So um, just so you kind of know how to use this time as efficiently as possible and what all we can talk about. I typically would prefer that we use it to talk about course material on a, so you read the chapters, and then the week after that is whenever we're going to talk about that information. Um, but I also, as long as we are all mindful of the time, um, I'm also open to practical questions related to just, your program, and just figuring out what are you going to do with your lives after what when you graduate again, right? Yeah. I remember people ask me that every time I graduate. It's like, well, what are you gonna do now? I was like, well, I think I'm gonna go back to school. I'm staying in. I'll keep going back till they won't let me go back. Yeah. Um, well, I'm gonna get the view. Oh, cool. I did gallery. Have you ever clicked on gallery mode? Makes us look like the Brady Bunch. Yeah. Um, well, with that said, um, this is kind of open-ended. I don't have any specific direction, unless nobody has any questions, but please feel free to let's talk.
Hi, Dr. Armstrong. I have a question.
Yeah.
So as I'm reading the chapters, there's a ton of names and dates and like the history.
Uh-huh.
Is that something that we need to memorize? Back from the 1700s.
Um, the main, like the big stuff, like some of the theorists, like the famous names, will not just this class, you'll also cover it in other classes too, especially your theories class. But apart from that, some of the dates in relation to like the laws, some of the federal laws and protections that are out there, you might have to know a couple of those. When I'm saying that, really, I mean, on your midterm and final, I'm pretty sure it's real straightforward, almost right out of the book, if you come across those test items. But I'm talking about in the future for licensure exams, it's not going to be like some random, you know, um, thinking like some random researcher that nobody ever talks about from, the early 20s or something. But the big ones might be on your licensure exams. Yeah.
I found the story about Darwin and how somebody knew him, and it just kind of evolved from that, and studying different um, topics and how that created tests and assessments and things like that. I found that really interesting, but I just have such a hard time remembering names.
Sure. Um,
You know,
I'm trying to remember, does your textbook talk about phrenology, Franz? Does anybody recall
uh,
coming across that name?
maybe.
Do you remember? It looks like it's like usually like a bust of a head, and it has like different areas of the scalp that pertain to different like personality traits. And they used to like, if you had a lump in a certain spot, like your skull was deformed or whatever uniquely, it could tell you like what was wrong with you. But
Um,
I don't remember coming across that in your book.
I don't think so.
If you ever get a chance to look that up, you should. It's not practical. You're not going to see that really on a licensure exam. It's more about, um, it's just good, kind of interesting to know where we came from. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you.
Uh-huh. What other questions do you guys have? Then has everybody finished your week 2 quiz? I didn't mean to call people out. It's okay. Nobody's judging. You can just you can pretend like your video's frozen when I ask those questions, by the way. Yeah. Man, when I was in my postdoc for Cycle Farm, we did this once a week. And there's one of my fellow students from Louisiana had was like in the middle of like a real big forensic case or something like that, and was working like 24/7, and ended up falling asleep on camera. And there's no way to like wake him up, right? Because we're not there. And so the whole class, we just watched this guy like silently snoring with his microphone on mute. I felt bad, but I was glad he was getting some sleep. You know. So feel free to do that if you'd like. None of us will judge you. You know. What other questions, you guys?
Um, I didn't read word for word, but chapter 6 and 7 about the raw scores and all that has a bunch of
Yeah.
formulas, all the like
Mhm.
how much of that is gonna be on the exam for licensure? Do we need to know those things to calculate actually certain things?
No,
No? Okay. Good.
no. Thankfully, no, because I don't think any of us would have ever gotten licensed if that were the case. I've never met a counselor out there or psychologist. Well, I've met some psychologists, but I've never met any counselors out there that got into this field to do a whole bunch of math, right? We are generally, not that we're not math people. A lot of people are math people, but we're generally, um, yeah, would
So
prefer to. Yeah, go ahead.
So am I right? We basically just understand the meaning of, like, say there's a 0 score, you know what that mean, or there is a standard deviation, you know what does, or it's just understand the concept of it when
Yeah, so
you look at it.
I'll let me talk about that for a moment. That's a good question. So you're talking about um almost into the interpretation of scores in relation to the normal bell curve, correct?
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. We can definitely talk about that because aspects of that, some of those concepts, not the math part, but just the concept really will be important to know. And I'll be honest with you, it would it will benefit you just career wise if you can memorize um, the normal bell curve, like the percentile ranks and what all that stuff means, and
Okay.
those percentile ranks in relation to different types of scores, like standard scores that are out there. And I'll give you an example of that. Won't just leave you hanging. I'm going to pull up a normal bell curve that I use in my practice. I'm pretty sure I can do this. I'm going to give you all a copy of the one that I created for my practice. And it kind of has, it's just a good like template for you to have to do that. I'm going to open the chat, figure out how to drag this thing over there, and get in there. Bell curve. There you go. So that's a PDF version of, just kidding. Or that is a PDF version of something, but mine is not popping up. Sorry, I'm trying to share my screen with you. It's wanting me to. I wish companies would stop changing stuff. It's like on a weekly basis that it's like the close button moves. It's like, am I losing my mind or did that close button move? And we're not losing our minds, people. I think there's somebody that's really angry in those jobs and like, you know what? If my life's gonna be hard, I'm gonna make life hard on everybody else. I'm gonna move that little X button from the right side to the left side, not tell anybody. Millions of people all upset across the world. Can't find it. Can y'all see this? Okay. So what we're looking at here is the normal bell curve. And what you were asking about is as far as knowing how to calculate the, for example, the standard deviation, those things like that. So like one standard deviation above the 50th percentile is the 84th percentile. You don't need to know how to calculate that. You don't have to memorize that formula. But what you would need to memorize are how do all these percentile ranks match to like IQ test scores and Z scores, things like that. Because they may ask a question like a Z score of a +1 is associated with what percentile rank? Okay. My son's about to come in. Hello, hello. Say hello. Yeah, I don't think they can see you. They just see a brain. Yeah. Yeah. Okay. Hang on 1 second. Give me 2 seconds, guys.
Does anybody know what the answer to his question would be?
I remember my statistics, the C-score is the number of standard deviations above or below the 50th. So a +1 would be the 75th percentile here. That's if I'm remembering correctly. Could be wrong.
All right. We made it. Made it. Okay. So I would like to talk about the standard scores and the common scores that you will come across as far as interpretation goes. But I also want to make sure that if somebody has questions related to, before we get to that point, fundamentally, I don't want to skip ahead too far, right? So does anybody have questions about just the nature of the bell curve or anything like that so far? Everybody's like, yeah, I question the nature of the bell curve. That's why I'm an accounting student. I question the nature of everything. So what you need to know about the bell curve, just fundamentally, if I could summarize some of the main points, would be if I give a test, any test from a psychological standpoint, whether that is a cognitive, an emotional, or behavioral test, and let's say I created a 10-item questionnaire related to depression, for example. If I gave it to you and you scored a 7 out of 10 on it, we don't know if that is high or low, right? I mean, because you can't just do a raw score. Who knows? We don't know if it's a high or low score unless we know what the average is, right, for the population. And it wouldn't be fair. So if I give you a cognitive test, let's say an IQ test, and it wouldn't be fair of me to give you a cognitive test and let's say you did, scored a 25 out of 30 on it. And for me to compare that score to a bunch of 10-year-olds, right? That wouldn't be fair really honestly to the 10-year-olds. It would make you have an IQ that would be off the charts. Does that make sense? Right. So when you look at the bell curve as it relates to testing and interpreting scores, you need to understand that when you line up scores from lowest to highest for most psychological like variables, and it applies to almost all psychological variables. And science doesn't know why. It's just a math thing, really. Probability wise, is this is the distribution of those scores. This is what it'll look like. So you're going to have a few people who have really low scores on any of those tests. A few people are going to have really high scores, but most people are going to, their raw scores are going to accumulate towards the middle, which is considered, what's the exact middle of that right there? What's that called?
The median.
So there's a median and
A mean
A
and a
mean.
mode.
Mhm. And what's the difference between the three?
The
The
mean is
median-
average.
Go ahead.
Sorry. The mean is average. The median is the half point. Like there are half people below this and exactly half people below that point.
Mhm.
The mode is I can't remember.
The mode is the
most
amount
repeated,
of numbers.
Yep, the number that
Yeah.
occurs.
the most often.
Yeah. And with a normal distribution, this would be a licensure kind of a question. They like to ask this question. And this is 100% true. So remember this. They will ask a question, something along the lines of, if we assume a normal distribution on a test of, let's say, depression, and normal distribution of scores, and and somebody's, I'm sorry, and the mean score is 105. What is the median score? That's what they'll ask you.
And they won't give you any other information?
Mm-mm. Because if you think about it, you're gonna, well, I'm gonna give you two quick tips. One, you're gonna feel like a deer in the headlight, like deer in headlights when you come across those kinds of questions on your licensure exam. You're gonna be like, I knew it, shouldn't have been a counselor. You're just gonna like want to walk away, but don't. Okay. They make questions like that if you can get past that initial like oh, anxiety response, because you will have them. I would even have it if I tried to take it. When you actually think through it, there's usually a logical like a logical way to deduce the correct answer. All right. So if we think about this one, if 105 is the mean, whatever 105 score is, let's just say, and we've got a normal distribution, right? Which means it doesn't lean left or right. It's completely even and predictable. Then 100% of the time, that
105.
median is going to be 105. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Yeah. Now, rarely is it ever true that happens. And why in the world do we even need to know that concept if we're going to be counseling people? How's that relate to counseling? Nobody knows. They just same reason why that person moved that X button on me a while ago. Yeah. So that's the kind of question that people will come across on licensure exams. But another important principle about the normal bell curve is that as the number of tests, that's the best way to say it. As the number of times you go to measure something increases, so does your chance for what? Somebody know? I know it's kind of an ambiguous question, but let's think through that one. As the number of times you measure something increases, so just by chance alone, you have an increased what? Let me give you a practical example. If you were going to roll a die, a pair of dice, is it die or dice? Whatever two of them is. If you're going to roll two of them, two dice, let's say 10 times. What's the chance of you getting snake eyes or like two sixes or whatever? What's the chance of that
Probability.
happening?
It goes up.
2 out of 10.
Yeah, it's pretty low, right?
It goes down.
Because the probability of getting a combination of numbers, right, that add up to like, what is it, 3, 4, or 5 or something like that, is much higher. But if you roll it 1,000 times, well, there's a really good chance that you're gonna get several outliers by doing so. In other words, as the number of times that you measure something increases, the chance of having just random outliers that are meaningless is going to happen. And the reason why that matters is because when you go look at like a psych report, from one of your clients, you'll see a lot of times they give you all the scores. You'll see a whole bunch of scores out there, and some clinicians might try to zoom in on one abnormal score and try to interpret that as being meaningful, as meaning something either good or bad, right? But you now know that unless you had a really, well, even then, in most cases, you can't interpret one isolated test score by itself, because as the number of times you measure something, the more likely you're going to get something on the ends of the bell curve, which by itself doesn't mean anything. Okay? Is everybody following that? Does that make sense? Okay, awesome. Another important thing to remember is when you test someone's psychological anything, the younger they are, the flatter this bell curve becomes. Why might that be? I was like, I don't know. That's why I'm taking this class.
I would guess like age versus experience. Like they're just not going to have a lot of the randomness, I guess, of somebody that's older.
So excuse my weird drawing that I've got going here.
It looks like the top of a car.
It does kind of, doesn't it? Like one of those air like efficiency design tests that engineers think they're going to do whenever they get their jobs, but nobody ends up actually doing that. Now what I'm drawing here is a flat bell curve. Oh, good grief. They did not make this for people with dysgraphia, people. That's what I have. What I'm trying to draw is a flat bell curve. This is the best way to make a line. All right. And show you the difference between the bottom one and the top one. Okay. We're just going to pretend it's matches. So in other words, the younger you are, the wider range of normal there will be between, I'm sorry, the wider range that the normal range will be. And it makes sense because if we were like, let's say we're measuring little kids' attention span, right? Well, because everybody's unique and different, there's a wider range of where those kids are at in development. Even if you had all down to the day, like, you know, they were all 6-year-old, 2 months and 27 days or whatever. Because they don't all develop at the same pace, there's going to be a wider range of what's normal. Right? Awesome. I'm glad y'all are as excited about that as I am. We'll have a pizza party next week to celebrate it. That's important fundamentally because when you go to interpret kids' test scores, you've got to start there and know that you get a lot more false positives with kids than you do with adults. Okay? Plus, if you think about it, if you had to test a kid, let's say test their attention span, you think the reliability for that test increases or decreases with age? What do y'all think?
Can you repeat the question one more time?
Sure. So if you had to measure attention span of kiddos, does the reliability of your attention span test increase or decrease with their age?
Decrease.
Decreases.
Increase, right?
The reliability increases. In other words, the younger you get, just because it ain't easy testing little kids, and sometimes it's just not going to happen. I will tell you this: I've had very few adults. When I go to, let's say I tested people's attention span with a computerized test. It's 20 minutes of like just staring at the screen, clicking. Every time you hear a one or see a one, you're just gonna click the mouse. And I've never had an adult lay on the floor with their hand up on the table while they're just like singing to themselves and they're just clicking. Never had an adult do that before, but I've had several little 6-year-olds do it. Okay. In other words, that test ain't measuring what it's supposed to measure. What it is, but whatever score they get, it's not going to be truly reflective of their attention as much as it's going to be reflective of maybe that test wasn't the best test design for a 6-year-old. Make sense?
Is that why for certain tests for kids, say ADHD, they recommend a certain age before you go testing because the result might not be reliable?
So, and that's a really good point. Absolutely. And there are two official answers to that question. One would be yes, because the younger a child becomes, the harder it is to determine what is normal and what's abnormal when it comes to executive functioning and attention development, because that's the frontal lobe. And then the other answer is there aren't really any reliable tests across the whole entire lifespan as it relates to ADHD.
Oh,
I know.
no, just on a personal note, it's kind of fun to hear that because my son is a 5-year-old, and next month I'm taking him to getting ADHD test, just
Awesome.
certain behaviors. But I'm always like, when he's on his good day, I'm like, oh, he's normal, and there are days like, no, he's something wrong.
Sure.
I'm like
Hey.
trying to.
Well, and just so you know, I'm not trying to discourage that at all. Like testing, what I'm saying though is there are no tests by themselves that are very reliable at assessing ADHD across a lifespan. But there are methods of combining testing with a patient's history, a review of their records, and observational data, and even like third-party report, like parent and teacher report, that when combined add up to enough incremental validity to land at a very solid diagnosis. And I've done it down to age 3. That's a rare thing for me to do, but am I as confident in that diagnosis as I would be for a 25-year-old? Probably not. But there is no such thing as like, it's not the same as like blood tests, basically. I think a lot of people think of it that way. It's like, well, either you have diabetes or you don't, which is not technically true, by the way, but that's besides the point. No, it's not. How do they arrive at that? How do they know if you have diabetes or not, right? They're going to test your what? Blood sugar level? Okay. Well, what's normal? Where'd they come up with normal?
By testing lots and lots of people.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
It's like body
Here's-
temperature. It's an average
Yeah.
of everybody.
Yep. And there's a range of what's normal, right? Like not everybody's gonna be 98.6. I'm telling you, if my temperature is in 98.6, I've got a fever. Because I wish I didn't, but my body wants to be in hibernation mode like all the time. It's like 97 point whatever. I had 96 one time. I was like, what's wrong with me? And then my wife, if she is at 99, that's like, or 99.5, that's like normal for her. Just hot all the time. Yep. So going back to the diabetes piece is that they came up with what's normal by testing, looking at the average blood glucose level of across a lot of people. But what we can brag about is that compared to that cutoff that they usually have, it's usually right around 100, by the way, for a fasted individual. Compared to that data, most of our tests do a better job at comparing apples to apples, because when they compare that number, that's compared to people with a wide range of age, both male and female, which does affect it, and with a whole bunch of like all kinds of crazy, complicated medical histories. So who knows, like, what the true average is? Because is there really such a thing as a person with a clean medical history? You know what I mean? It's like, have you ever had a cold? No, I haven't. Okay, well, we're going to test that one person. That's it. So another important fact to know, I guess I ended up, see, this is what happens. You ask a question and I deliver, but too much. Another important concept to remember is how these tests are created. And you need to, before you give any test, you don't know if that's a good test or not. I don't care how pretty the packaging is, because they will come up with some real pretty packaging. You need to know, who did they give this to? How do we know what's normal scores on this thing? And where did they publish that data? And I would highly encourage you to review that before you spend any of your hard-earned money on whatever test that is.
I have a question with regard to that.
Sure.
So with little kids, especially when you're testing them, so I know sometimes testing is done with parents and sometimes testing is done without parents.
Mm-hmm.
When looking at the tests, should you also evaluate that? Because I had the unique experience of watching my son do speech therapy when I was in the room and when I was on the other side of a double-sided mirror that he didn't know I was there for. And watching your own kid around other people when you're not there shows you how much different they are when you're not there. And
Yeah.
so that would then lead me to think if you were testing for something like ADHD with a kid and their parent is there, they're going to act significantly different than they are when their parent is not there.
Right.
So
And
would that be important in that test as well?
100%. In fact, most, and we'll get there and talk about the different types of tests, but when I say this, just don't worry if you don't know it already. Most performance-based tests that like cognitive tests, things like that, they were normed on kiddos that did not have their parent present in the room. I say most, essentially all of them were. So when a parent is in the room, even if for that kiddo, we're like, there's no way that affected it. We don't know 100% because that's not we're not comparing apples to apples at that point. That's a pretty significant factor to have a parent in the room. Does it mean it's worthless information? No, it means it's still good data, but you might not be able to interpret the same way as you would if you had the same scores from a kid without the parent in the room. Yeah.
Yeah, that's what I was thinking about, just because, like I said, I got to watch that. That was completely fascinating.
So I was recently on a forensic case that I was testing a 9-year-old whose parent was suing a big company due to exposing some sort of chemical to this 9-year-old. And as it turned out, we didn't end up having a separate testing place because it was not at my office. It was offsite, like in a different state. And I had to have the parent present, like, or at least nearby, like within vision or earshot. And whenever I tested that kid with mom nearby, we had some really, really low scores. And I was like, I'm not buying it. And so I said, I didn't tell anybody else this. It's just in my own head. I was like, I really do want to see how they perform without mom present, just on the off chance that what I was measuring was not valid. And as it turned out, and it's not always the case, but in this case it was, as it turned out, when mom wasn't present, our ability or capabilities jumped up by a good, like, I would say, well, for example, they went from an IQ of an 85, which is the low average range, 16th percentile, to an IQ between the 84th and 88th percentile. So like over here. Sorry, I was trying to draw up there. Oh, good grief. Right there. So they went from, there to there. And that's without mom present. And so considering that was the only thing that changed, and that I wasn't given the same test, but I was giving a test that had been co-normed so that there's a form A and a form B. So they're mutually, you could compare the results. Because if I gave you like a math test today, you did, not great on it, you might go home and study, and if you knew you were coming back to take the exact same test tomorrow. Well, we're not actually measuring your math capabilities yesterday. Anyway, my point there is that, yes, you're completely correct. Environment, those kinds of factors play a huge role in how valid the results are. And most tests are going to have a standardized way that you administer it, even questionnaires, by the way, that if you don't follow, the less you follow it, the less valid your results are going to be when it comes to interpreting it the way they want you to interpret it. Does that make sense? If you ever have sentences that you say that are real long and you're like, I think I wrapped that up, but I'm not sure. It might just be a professor thing.
I do
sure.
that.
Yeah.
And then everybody in the room is looking at you like,
Why are we talking about coffee?
yeah. Yes. And my whole house with ADD goes, squirrel. You know, so
They're like,
Yeah.
Dr. Armstrong, I just said you had nice shoes. Now we're talking about coffee. How'd that happen? I'm trying to think other important things to consider with the bell curve. Oh, okay. If I gave you 100 tests, let's just say 100 tests of all psychological variables, all kinds, right? But they were all technically measuring different things. So they're not measuring the exact same thing, but they're measuring different things, different psychological variables. I would expect around 90% of your scores to fall between. Give me a second here. This is getting ridiculous. Where's the erase button? Where did they move that? But they moved it. Anyways, I'm just gonna say it. I would expect about 90% of scores to be between the 16th percentile and the 84th percentile. And that's for healthy individuals. So in other words, that means theoretically we're going to have 5% scores that are really high. It might be a good or bad thing, we don't know. We're going to have about 5% scores that are really low. Again, that might be a good or bad thing. If we're talking about depression, the higher it goes, the more depression, then it might be good to have a low score. But a healthy individual will produce about 10% of randomly abnormal scores, or up to that amount, by the way. Along those lines, the more psychopathology that we have, in other words, the more like diagnosable mental health disorders we have, and or the lower our IQ goes, our intelligence, the probability of those abnormal scores to show up increases. So it goes from only 10% of the scores being abnormal to about 20 to 25% of scores being abnormal for those individuals. Does that make sense? So
Can you repeat for which individuals that occurs?
Sure. So for like psychologically healthy, I'm gonna put quotes around that because I'm not gonna let a bunch of white dudes from the American Psychiatric Association declare if I'm healthy or not, right? Those dudes are on their yachts. Nobody's healthy except for me. But compared to, so when you take somebody who's psychologically healthy, we expect about 10% of their scores to be abnormal, either abnormally high or abnormally low, or a combination of both. When you have somebody with a whole bunch of, well, as you like add diagnoses of mental illness to that person, there's an increased chance that if I tested 100 psychological variables, that they're going to have more abnormal results. I mean, it just makes sense, actually. I know it sounds ridiculous to say it. There's so many principles that are so, like when you boil them down like that, you're just like, why did I not like grasp it? And I just now realized like that's a principle that I just realized. So I love statistics because it's not real math. You already know all this stuff. It's just that it's called special things by statisticians. But when you zoom out, you're going to understand you know all these things already. In other words, when somebody has psychopathology, as a product of their psychopathology, they're going to score abnormal. Everybody's like, yeah, I don't have to have a master's degree to know that. You're right, you don't. You expect more abnormality in the test scores as you increase the abnormality of that person's psychological makeup. But that's important though, because by doing so, you also increase the chance of getting false positives. Okay. Man, I can see y'all's eyes being like, listen, I know we're not talking about math, but guy, this isn't exciting. Like, I see that you're excited about it, but yeah. I completely understand. It starts to be fun though when you start to explore some of the tests, because you're going to be like, man, I wish I would have paid more attention in that class now. It will be fun because you get to interpret things. You get to be the official interpreter of, test scores and things like that. And I'm telling you, if you only remember what we've talked about tonight so far, you know more off the cuff right now than most physicians could talk about. I promise you. I promise. I have a friend of mine who is a forensic and clinical neurologist, super smart guy. But we were talking about the blood test the other day of a patient, and I was like, yeah, but man, that's not what the standard error measurement is on that test. He's like, what? It's like, don't do that. Don't do that. You get paid way more than me, man. Come on. It's like standard error measurement. He's like, oh, I haven't even thought about that since med school. I was like, glad I'm not your patient then.
Wow.
Good grief. Yeah. But that's the case for everybody. Like, there's the more you know on the stats side, the more confident you can be. I promise. The more confident you can be in interpreting these things well. But there's a bunch of people out there just willy-nilly, just because they think they know, and just pretending like they know. I once had my labs done. I keep picking on doctors, but really it's not fair. But I once had my labs done, and I asked my general practitioner, I was like, what are those scores? He's like, I don't know. Because it was like one of those random like liver enzyme parts of it. And he's like, I don't know. It's not my specialty. Yeah. So I am gonna probably wrap us up, but before I do that, does anybody else have any other questions, or anybody like to? Yes, ma'am.
I'm wondering, whenever you're talking about patient scores and how many of them, the 10% on either side versus the 80% in the middle, how often do you think that those scores are inaccurate because patients manipulate their responses based on knowing the rubric, the scoring rubric, and they want a diagnosis or they don't want a diagnosis?
Well, I'm so glad you asked that, because that's like one of my favorite topics. Not that.
Sorry.
No. And I'll be as concise as I possibly can, and make note that let's also explore that a little bit further next time. But to make a long story short on my answer would be, unless you are actively and objectively measuring their bias tendencies, and there are ways to do that, unless that test is doing that in addition to measuring whatever it's measuring, then I don't even care all that much about whether or not what that test looks like. And I'll give you an example. The Vanderbilt questionnaire for ADHD is a good example. You print that, you can go print it out right now, and it doesn't really have to you don't have to have a degree to go. First of all, just Google Vanderbilt and like, how should I answer this if I want my kid to have ADHD, or how should I answer it if I don't want him to have it? But the test itself doesn't have, or it's not a test, the questionnaire itself doesn't have any validity questions in it. So if somebody went through there, just drew, on a Scantron like a Christmas tree or something like that for the test, you would have no idea if that's the case or not. Was that random or anything like that? All of the good tests in psychology, in my opinion, and in the counseling world, are tests that have built-in either questions or ways that we can statistically analyze the questions to determine, is this person likely to be exaggerating or underreporting? And if it can't do that, then it's a worthless test, in my opinion. Even I hate to be that much of a blanket statement, but I say it's worthless only because it's worthless in court. That's why. Those things like that don't hold up, because the judge is always going to ask, he's like, if I want to have ADHD, I guess I just check all these gray boxes, right? It's like, that's not evidence. That's all you have to do. Yeah. That's not objective. I'm hoping that I answered your question. I think I did.
Mhm.
Okay. But we will talk more about that if you'll make a note to remind me, because I can almost promise you I'm not going to remember. I wish I would, but yeah. Any other questions? Okay, I'm gonna, and I want to say more. It's like my OCD kicking in. Compelled to tell you one more fun fact about what we just talked about. Please remember that those validity questions and items and ways to assess it cannot ever assess intentionality. So in other words, do they do it intentionally or not? Intentionality is a legal term. It is not a term in relation to psychology or counseling. You can't objectively measure intentionality. What you can measure is response bias, though. You can measure, okay, well, this person scored exactly the same way that all this other group did who's suing somebody for $1 million. And who knows if that's meaningful, but that's important to make note of in relation to whether or not this is valid. Does that make sense?
Mhm.
Yeah. But we can't say, well, they're doing it just to get money. Well, we don't know that. We don't know. Nobody would ever be able to know intent. Unless we could read their mind. We can't do that yet, despite what my family thinks I do. All right, folks, y'all have a wonderful evening, and I will get this posted tomorrow, and hopefully get y'all some extra video. I want to do some extra videos. I'm shooting for it, really shooting for it. So, all right, y'all take care.
Good night.
Good night.
Right. Well,